How do you like my metaphor here?
I thought it was great. That was the most dramatic intro video I've ever seen. So thank you for that.
Right. We're just getting. I mean, we can do it standing up, but what are your thoughts in terms of trust and ethics and values in humanity being the central pillar? This is something I talk about on a regular basis. Am I on the right track?
Yes, I believe you are. What's happened is, I think, as we've evolved as a species, we have tools that are billions of times more powerful than, say, even 100 years ago. And therefore, how we navigate our relationships, our trust structures, is absolutely the most important piece. Jerry Mikulski, who's one of our world, made a really profound comment. He said, we was talking about abundance and scarcity.
Yep.
And he said, it's really simple. Scarcity is abundance minus trust. I thought, damn, I have to think about that for an hour, but he's right. And so how do we navigate that? How do we scale that to map onto the world that's coming?
Yeah. Salim, could you just take us through your journey through life? I mean, you've come from India, you moved to Canada, you were an entrepreneur. Can you just share your journey with us?
Okay, I can go, let's try and keep it light and simple. Grew up in Bombay, moved to Canada when I was 10. My parents emigrated. My father hated noise, dirt, pollution, and corruption. So India is not the greatest place in the world if you don't like those things. I did my schooling and university in Canada. Then I went to Europe for 10 years, did building large-scale computing systems and then doing management consulting. Because we'd have this problem, we'd build this amazing computer system, but the company was not set up to use it properly, and it would just get sitting on a shelf. So you'd spend a year of your life building a large-scale computing architecture that never got used, which is very, very frustrating. And so I did management consulting for a while, a lot of French companies, which is why I'm bald. And that will make sense to some of you if you've interacted with French companies. When I talk about immune systems, they have big ones there. And then ended up in New York and started building technology companies. And I ended up building the predecessor to Twitter. And we were 18 months too early, which is really bad if you're in entrepreneurship. Being early is much worse than being late.
I've been there at least a couple of times in my life.
Everybody has arrows in their back from being too early to a domain. But it got me well known. I ended up on the West Coast and became the head of innovation at Yahoo. And there I learned kind of one of the fundamental guiding principles that's driving us today, which is when you attempt disruptive innovation in any legacy organization, the immune system attacks you. Right? Because all of our organizations are designed to withstand risk and resist change. And yet that's now the high order bit. And dealing with that is almost all of the work that we do now. So I was there for a couple of years at Yahoo, and I was staggered that at a company that's less than 10 years old, you had this problem. It should be way more free-flowing, et cetera, and I've got some viewpoints on why that happened. And I went from there I set up a relationship between Yahoo and NASA to do some interesting projects together. And one day the NASA people said, hey, we're helping create this thing called Singularity University. We're bringing 70 thought leaders together to talk about is it worth creating an educational institution only focused on accelerating technologies? And so I went to this one-day event, and I'd never heard of Ray Kurzweil. I'd never heard of Peter Diamandis. I'd never heard of the X Prize. I'd never even heard of the Singularity. I just happened to not have come across any of that. And walked in, top of my head lifted off a bit. I asked a lot of questions, and about 2 weeks later, Peter calls and said, would you like to run it? So I got home that day. My wife said, how was your day? And I said, I'm a dean. I don't know how that happened, but so did 3 years in kind of the founding CEO role, and then another 4 or 5 years running most of the programs there. So probably my secret superpower is that if there's a lecture, lab, discussion, workshop on blockchain, I've heard it 60 times, right? Or autonomous cars 60 times, AI 60 times. So I can pretend to speak about anything at this point.
So you're not an expert, you're a generalist.
I'm way generalist. Very light on the detail is, if you ask any of my team, they're way light on the details, yeah.
Which probably is a good segue talking about experts. I've heard you speak about experts and why expertise is becoming something that actually slows you down rather than accelerates you.
Well, if you think about becoming an expert in a domain, you do a general degree, then you do a master's degree, then you do a PhD. And at each point, you're narrowing and narrowing and narrowing your focus, right? So if you're doing a master's in in biology, you're studying the gene sequence of one earthworm for like 5 years. And you're so deep down in the weeds, you can't see the wood for the trees. This is the case with many of our expertise. We spend a large amount of time on a very, very narrow topic. Well, in a world where aggregate effect is changing so fast, that doesn't help you. Right? And so at Singularity, when we were accepting students, we would use what was called the Stanford T-design, where we pick people that have deep expertise in one area, so they've demonstrated rigor, academic structure, ability to think and use different frames, and then you take them across to different areas. And then most, breakthrough innovation always happens when you cross disparate areas, right? So what if you create a cocktail of the 10 fastest moving technologies with the global thought leaders in those spaces and point people at the biggest problems? Something interesting happens, you swirl that around. And so that's been profoundly successful in educating a class and a cadre of maybe 100,000 people around the world that have learned how to think in that way. What we're now working on is how do you now apply that to transform legacy companies, business sectors, government sectors, etc.
Let me stay with that point in terms of expertise, and that is that in the solar sector, for example, the cost of solar has been declining massively, and most experts did not believe it can go down that far. Mobile phones, there's a very famous story about Vinod Khosla, where he just went on to all the accounting and consulting firms asking about, I have a slide later on, and it was basically talking about how the future is going to look like.
Yeah.
And they were just getting it wrong by a factor of 10 every single time.
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because we were able to show, let me recount the Vinod Khosla thing.
Yep.
So we've seen exponential growth in mobile phones. And in the decade of the 2000s, we started off in the year 2000 with 100 million mobile phones around the world. Doubled every 2 years. Went from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 million to 1.6 billion over the decade. And Vinod did an amazing piece of research. He went back through the decade and he asked the question, how will the mobile industry expert analysts predict that pace of change? Gartner, Forrester, Jupiter, McKinsey's, et cetera, et cetera. And so we went back to 2002 and looked at all of the aggregate reports from 100 million to 200 million. He found that the predictions in the year 2000 were 16% growth. So it doubled it by 100%, so they were off by quite a bit. But their next prediction didn't go up, it went down. Their next prediction was 14% growth because they expected it to level off, right? People thought, okay, we've had this burst for some reason. It's got to level off, it can't keep going like this. And then it went up another 100%. And then the next prediction was 12%, right? So then it went up another 100%, and their final prediction was 10%, and it went up another 100%. Now, this is where the 10 times comes in. If you're the global industry mobile expert analyst and you're predicting 10% growth in mobile phones and it actually is 100%, you should lose your job. Right? Governments and big companies are relying on these predictions to make... and I ended up talking to David Frigstad, the head of Frost & Sullivan. And he said, look, it's really, really hard. On an exponential curve, if you miss one hop, one step, you're off by 50%. So getting it right is incredibly difficult. But for God's sakes, at least get the general trend. And we found in domain after domain, people have this blind spot to seeing this exponential curve. And cognitively, we can't get our heads around it.
You talk about paradigm shifts and some of the new paradigms that are there. What are they, and how do we reconcile to them?
Paradigm shifts in which area? Because it's happening across the board.
It's happening across the board. I mean, I'm looking at EXOs as an example, or organizations, corporations that are becoming much, much more autonomous, and that's another shift. Democratization is another shift. Demonetization is another shift. And these are huge shifts. And so what does demonetization mean for something like this? Because should it be free, and in the future, am I just going to do that, and it will probably work? These are some of the big shifts that are taking place, and we still don't know exactly how to cope with them, and how does industry cope with them?
Most of the time it doesn't, and this is why we end up with the stress that we do in all of our legacy organizations. Peter has defined this very well. He's come up with 6 Ds, right? Digitization, democratization, demonetization, deception, because it's that exponential curve looks linear for a very long time until it hits the knee of the curve, and then everybody goes, oh, it's a black swan, right? And so the training part of it is, can you spot those doubling patterns early? Because if you don't spot them early, they disrupt you very badly. If you can spot them early, biggest advantage you could possibly have, right? Just as an example, if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, we had 0.25% electric vehicles sold in China. And people are, okay, small amount. Next year it was 0.5%. Year after that was 1%. Last year it was 2.5%. This year it's 5%. You run the numbers and you go, there's a classic doubling pattern. Now you talk to the mobile industry analysts and they will not tell you that next year it'll be 10%. But this is the kind of the big, brilliant insight from Ray Kurzweil, who showed that once you have a doubling pattern, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going. And we just can't get our heads around that. So I predicted next year it'll be 10, 20, 40, 80.
You speak about to creativity coming in points of intersection of various industries and various segments. You talk about the Gutenberg moment. What is that, and how many Gutenberg moments are we looking at the moment?
So you had a great slide of them earlier. We saw this slide from before. So the Gutenberg moment is the printing press in the 15th century. When we were able to add technology to printing, we moved and we were able to distribute the Bible and other works to mass audiences, and that completely changed the world. And we call that a Gutenberg moment because it fundamentally changed society. And we argue today that we have 20 of those hitting us at the same time. So solar energy fundamentally changes the world completely. Then you add in blockchain, it changes the world completely. Then you add in AI, then you add in robotics, autonomous cars, drones, biotech breakthroughs, 3D printing. Each one on its own changes society completely. And we have 20 of them. And we have never seen this before in the history of the world. In the past, you had maybe one breakthrough or another breakthrough at any given point, the steam engine converting manual labor and so on. And society had time to absorb it. And the enormous challenge we have globally is that with 20 of these hitting us at the same time, we don't have time to absorb it. And it's breaking all of our legacy institutions. In fact, I can't see a single institution, healthcare, education, legal systems, intellectual property is completely broken. All of our legacy mechanisms and institutions by which we run the world are breaking one by one as this onslaught of technology comes along.
The software of any country is its constitution. That's how it runs. The software of a society is the legal system. And as we were in the car coming in, I spoke about pre-legal. Most of these things are not illegal, but they're not legal yet. Therefore, they are pre-legal. What do we need to do to try and accelerate regulators and others to sort of get with the plot? Yeah,
so exponential regulation is like an oxymoron, right? I mean, it's sublinear at best. And this is the big challenge that we have. What's the good news and bad news, depending on how you put it, is that these new technologies, because of the democratization, are just routing around legal structures, right? And so it'll force the legal structures to keep pace. The European Central Bank popped up and said, just blankly full out, said, we will not be able to regulate cryptocurrencies. They just came out and said it. They're correct. Fabulous that they admitted it. But this is the big, enormous challenge in how do you navigate this now. Now, we have old ways of dealing with it. The old way is, okay, some new technology arrives. The government gets together and says, okay, what should our policy be? They then create some sort of legal structure for enforcement of that policy, and there we go. And back when innovation was moving more slowly, you had that worked. But today it's moving too quickly, right? Uber is successful by deliberately breaking the law, leapfrogging to public acceptance, and waiting for policy to catch up. It's working for them, but it's just not a very pleasant process for the rest of us.
I mean, in this country, for example, they were asked, I mean, they were suspended a few times before they, and now they're obviously, they're around everywhere.
It bounces back and forth. Government kind of can't figure out whether to, this is a great little anecdote. So I've been living in Miami the last few years. And Fort Lauderdale Airport, which is kind of the second airport for Miami, banned Uber. Because the taxi drivers complained too much and the mayor was getting some contributions from them, and so they banned Uber. Within 3 weeks, there was a massive outcry from people, and people just started saying, well, the hell with it. I'm not ever flying into Fort Lauderdale again. I'm only going to fly to Miami Airport. The airlines suddenly started seeing a drop in tickets, and the airlines ended up having a bigger impact than the taxi drivers, and they reinstated Uber, right? And people don't think about people complain about, okay, they're breaking the law or they're breaking the social contract. They don't see the other effects, the positive effects. Our brains always see the negative effects. We don't see the positive effects. So I was talking to the mayor of Miami. He's told me the minute that Uber showed up, drunk driving deaths dropped 50%. Just unbelievable, the incredible advantages in labor liquidity. And my favorite story, again, not to pick on the French, is from France, where the banlieue around Paris, the suburbs, are kind of hotbeds of North African, drugs. It's like South Central LA in the 80s. If you go in, you may not come out again. And the French government has spent $40 billion trying to solve the banlieue through enforcement, different structures, and it's been pretty much a miserable failure for 40 years, despite the amount of money spent. And then Uber comes in, and 18 months later, crime has dropped 10 times because they're all out driving. So meanwhile, the French government is trying to shut down Uber while it's solving a $40 billion problem for them, right? And that's the insanity of trying to deal with the world today. It's very, very hard.
I've read a lot of your work, and I've been sort of tracking you. I'm almost a stalker, Salim. So, and one of the things which fascinated me is that, as I have my first degrees in economics, is that simple supply and demand. And as companies are growing into the future, you're bringing down the cost of supply down to zero, and the cost of demand down to zero. So you give the example of Airbnb. They want another room. The cost of creation of additional supply is zero.
Very
and the
low,
cost of creation of demand is also near zero, which is because people are sending it out there. In this new world of where the new companies are reducing the cost of supply to as low as possible, so the marginal cost is extremely low, and the marginal revenue to create that is also very low. What's the future? How does it all come together? What's going to happen to organizations and corporations?
So this is why I gave this talk last year called Death to Corporations, obviously a very provocative title. The basic thesis was that all of our businesses and industries for thousands of years are mostly 99+% are focused on selling scarcity. Right? If you didn't have scarcity, you didn't have a business. So you got an asset or a workforce, you put a legal boundary around it, a hotel on a beach, a great chef, a great design team, a great product, and you sold access to scarcity. And that's how we basically made money, and capitalism runs for the last thousands of years. Now we're seeing new business models around abundance. Uber tapping into an abundance of extra cars lying around, Airbnb with hotels, as you say. And the enormous challenge for corporations and industries that are focused on scarcity, energy is a classic example, and it's worth just highlighting the metrics here. Energy's been doubling every 22 months in its price performance for the last 40 years, and at its current pace, we will be able to deliver 100% of global energy supply with solar in 12 years. We're 6 doublings away. Now, this causes unbelievable stress for the oil and gas industry, right? Which is totally geared. And so what you see happen is there's a cognitive dissonance. The wall slams down. And so I had this fabulous conversation with the chairman of Hess Oil, which is one of the big oil companies in the US. And he comes to me, and I did a talk for board members of Fortune 1000 companies last year. And he came to me and said, look, I've got to ask you a question. He goes, I just heard your talk. You're talking about solar. I get it. I see the data. You have the valid data to show this. I just came from the 3,000 person energy conference in Houston, where the Minister of Energy for Saudi came as the opening keynote, and they talked about the future of oil and gas for 3 days. Not a single mention of this was mentioned in this 3,000 person conference talking about the future of oil and gas for the last 3 days. I go, yeah, because they don't know how to deal with it. This wall comes down, and you kind of just go, I can't handle, and you just pretend it's not there. Then all of a sudden it hits you, and then you're going, oh shit, what do you do? Right? And so this is the enormous challenge we have in all of our legacy organizations. This is what I call the immune system problem.
So if you were to drive down from here to Abu Dhabi, and which is about 200 kilometers from here, and let's say we drive down in a Tesla. Once I bought my Tesla, and 60, 70, 80% of my time is self-driving, so I can chill out. And then a couple of charging stations, and I'm in Abu Dhabi, and it doesn't cost me anything. What happens to the oil companies? What happens to all the taxi companies? What happens there? I mean, how do we re-look at this whole philosophy of this new model, basically.
Well, I mean, the whole thing collapses because you don't have the direct sales. You have all the secondary industries that come along with it, right? Just as an example, I'm using a U.S. number here just because I happen to know it. 25% of all cigarettes are sold at gas stations. So now you automate or you electrify driving and people aren't stopping at gas stations. What happens to cigarette sales or confection sales or sales of Coca-Cola, et cetera, which has a massive set of outlets in these types of areas. So you've got all sorts of secondary and tertiary effects. Jerome obviously studies a lot of these in terms of how do you think about foresight and future management and future planning around this. And the simple reality is we have no idea. You tend to get bounce back. For example, there's a boom in Ferrari and Maserati sales today because people are realizing that's probably the last car I'm ever going to own. It better be a good one. Right? So there's this weird a bounce effect of people realizing we're going to a different model. Better enjoy the loud car while I can. Right? And so you get this kind of these odd effects, and we can see those effects coming. And we can kind of predict for them. The Gartner hype cycle is a classic example of that type of an effect. The question is, the longer term implications are so profound that it's very, very hard to get your heads around that. When energy is basically free, what does that do for the world? Right? The poorest countries in the world are the sunniest countries in the world. And so that totally changes the equation completely.
I have a couple of slides which I'll put up just as a reference point, and then I'll ask Salim questions on those slides if you allow me.
All right.
One of them is, these are some of the big mega trends that are taking place, tectonic shift west to east. Urbanization, 300-400 cities are going to run the show. How does that affect, how does it recalibrate the world?
Well, I think what we're seeing on the technology side, that's quite clear. On the urbanization, in theory, we crossed a line a few years ago where more than 50% of the world lives in cities. Turns out that number was really wrong. It's not 50%, it's actually close to 90% today. Because in Egypt, a city of less than 100,000, a city of 100,000 was classified as a town or a village. It wasn't classified as a city, whereas 100,000 is a reasonably urban environment. So when they recalibrate it for the actual reality, we're already living 85 to 90% in cities. What I think I see happening there, Paul Sappho, one of our good friends, made this point that we're going to see a huge de-emphasis on the concept of nation states and a huge emphasis of city-states, right? Dubai, Abu Dhabi are city-states. The Emirates becomes less relevant as a concept when you have this kind of structure.
So the mayors will become stronger than
the mayors basically run the world today.
Right.
In Canada, where I'm living currently, the provinces or the states basically hold the cities hostage. That's their only role, is to hold back funding if the city doesn't do what they want. That's the only thing they have. And so how do you now get rid of that? Yeah. I think the analogy I would make is in the same way that we're kind of technology is hollowing out the middle class, yeah, and technology is hollowing out layers of management and companies. States, nation states, and states and provinces are basically the middle management of governance. They're being hollowed out as well. Of course, they don't go quietly into the night. And the problem with nation states is they have armies, and so you have to deal with that. But over time, we will see a much more increased emphasis. Now the mayors are openly defying what the country wants to do, right, because their city is much more relevant.
There are a few people here who have gray hairs in this room. I talk about the silver tsunami. How many people know what silver tsunami is? One, two people who've seen it. Well, by the year 2025, 75% of the people working will be millennials. But 75% of the spend will be for 50 and over. And they're going to be living to about 90 years of age because of better medical health and so on, perhaps even. So now, with that, they've got another 35, 40 years to live, and they're being forgotten in this whole process of this whole surge of millennials. What I'm saying is, here's a silver tsunami. Do you think this is a forgotten sector?
Well, I would rename it the gleaming tsunami, because I think the more advanced word from just the gray is to go straight to the skinless version where the light gleams off your head. So I would frame it that way, but definitely happening. But the problem will become that because as we move forward very rapidly, money is becoming less relevant over time. right? We've used money, capitalism, currency, economies to basically run the world for the last few hundred years very successfully. But the modality and the main mode of discourse, which has been commerce, etc., is changing from money to information. Right? Today, a startup is much more interested in gathering data about its users, and it's fungible. They can convert it to money later. Over time, the information becomes more relevant. If I have a medical procedure that costs a ton of money, it's going to be much better to have a more detailed diagnosis of what's happening, and I know exactly what to do at a very low cost than trying to throw a big amount of money at my body trying to figure out what to do. So over time, we're going to see information becoming more relevant, which is why Jeremy Rifkin kind of projects out further and says, we're ending up with a zero marginal cost society, and what happens? So over time, as money becomes less relevant, just take health, just take energy. As energy becomes lower cost, as energy becomes, say, very low cost, and we basically give it away for free for other business models on top of that, advertising, subscription, et cetera, basically you have a lot more extra money to spend on other things. And over time, it's very clear that healthcare, education, energy become very, very low to zero cost. So the cost of living drops very dramatically in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So the big challenge will be, where do you spend your money? Which is kind of a weird problem to have, but that's where we'll end up, I think.
Are we looking at the end of capitalism as we know it?
Yes.
Okay, moving on.
How else to say that except for...
As we know it. I mean, there was a little qualifier there.
Yeah.
So a couple of points. I mean, obviously this is...
Just think about this. The benefit and the beauty of capitalism is the market structures reward highly efficient structures.
Yeah.
Right? But as we get to a world of abundance, you don't need the same hyper efficiency of supply chain and other things.
Right.
It doesn't matter if my device is 10% better at conserving energy when I'm doubling the amount of energy I can get. So we'll see this again, a reverse effect of radical misuse of resources. As we don't care how much energy we use on things, we'll just start splashing things around in weird ways.
You mentioned abundance several times. What about convergence? Because everything is now becoming abundant, and then they're sort of converging and cross-fertilizing and stuff, and that's where a lot of new innovation is happening. So is convergence an integral part of the future?
It is, especially, as I said before, major breakthroughs happen at the intersections of major, cryptocurrency is an intersection of computer science and cryptography, right? You intersect those and you create a whole new domain. And so it's really interesting to study the intersections of these technologies because entire new industries spark right at that point. And so looking at the intersections of technologies and the applications that may come out of it, there's a really interesting exercise in future studies and forecasting to say, okay, let's look at the intersections of these technologies and then see how it applies to a particular industry. And when you do that, it's impossible, it's hard to see a single industry that doesn't get totally radically transformed. Right. Like not one.
This was the 6 Ds that we were talking about, digitization, deception, disruption, and so on. We've discussed this. This study, which was at Babson College, the 75% of the companies in the S&P 500 will no longer exist by the year 2025. And 50% of the companies replacing those 75% have not been born today. So we're sitting in a startup accelerator. These are the companies that are going to make it there. So this was to do with that. And this is the other thing which Salim spoke about, which was that companies from the 20th century that are focused on managing scarcity and efficiency and productivity, they're going down, and the information-based companies are going up. What I'd like to talk to you about is that in all of this disruption, these have been disrupted, these are being disrupted, and they are the ones holding back the most, it seems. We spoke about energy quite a lot. Is it just because of lobbies and stuff like that, or is it more than that? I mean, these are all fundamental businesses that are slower at disrupting and more in terms of resisting change.
So I would put it, let me make a couple of comments here. I would move this down a bit. I think this is, the lobbying and the regulatory props this up for the time being.
Right.
Water and food will get disrupted more quickly, but the supply chain there is so deep and so entrenched that it's hard to deal with this. These for sure are the slowest to move, but this will be disrupted much more quickly just because of the rise of solar and battery technologies. Just as an example, battery technology is lagging behind solar by about 5 years, but only by about 5 years. And once you have solar and storage at the same level of sophistication, the business model of every electrical utility in the world disappears in 5 years. I mean, this is insane. And we've run a sprint with DIWA to talking about how do you adapt to this world. So I think the general categorization is correct. Today, the regulatory capture is the safest place to go, right? So when you have disruption, typically there's 3 levels of it. The first thing that happens is a big company looks at a disruptive company and says, okay, we'll buy it, shut it down. Let's just do that. And that's a favorite tactic in the energy space or the payments industry, which has been doing this kind of thing for a long time. And that was possible in the 80s and 90s when, for say in energy, when there were maybe 5 or 10 solar companies appearing a year because it cost so much. But now because of the demonetization and democratization, there's 5,000 solar companies and you can't shut down 5,000. So the buying them up and shutting them down doesn't work anymore. It's not possible. The second layer then is to say, okay, let's lobby them out of existence, right? Which is the favorite tactic today. There's this fabulous discussion in the US where H&R Block and QuickBooks are lobbying the government to stop electronic filing of taxes. And they're winning, by the way, they're winning, because what's your business model if people can e-file taxes? Now, much better for society, but damn it, those companies will go out of business. So they're literally holding, this is the big challenge, I think, in the US today, is regulatory capture so thorough that it's going to create unbelievably inefficient structures and the whole thing collapses over time.
Last couple of issue that I'd like to talk about, and then we'll open up to questions, and that is artificial intelligence. So I had actually no, this one is first one. This is you've seen this curve before, I'm sure, hundreds of times.
Various versions
of this. This is our future. What do we need to do as companies and as businessmen, as investors, and so on, to actually cope with this kind of future? Unless this is getting in. How do we cope with this future?
You don't really, for the most part. The only way we found out to deal with this is if I take, say, a company, is you can't transform the core. It's too difficult. You'll evoke this immune system response, and you end up in a huge political fight. The only way we found to do it is to set up exponential organizations at the edge of the company, let them build into this future, keep a brick wall between the two. Over time, that becomes your new gravity center. Right? So one, set up edge organizations, which is what structures like this are great for. The second order of sophistication is when you see something succeeding, for God's sakes, don't bring it back in. Right? Because the more disruptive it is, the more it won't fit in the legacy organization, and then you end up in that mess. Spin it off and let that become the bigger. Nestle, for years, tried to run Nespresso as a line of business. Failed. Finally, they set up as a separate company, and boom, it's a $6 billion line of business, right? And so that's what's possible if you can have the discipline and the leadership to actually set things up on the edge independently.
And is that what the EXO work that you do is talking about, is how to get an espresso to become an edge rather than a part of the main thing?
Yes, because the core organization in legacy industries or structures will not tolerate anything this disruptive. They'll kill it. Right? And you know, we've all seen the history of big companies buying startups and then killing them as they go inside the mothership, inadvertently, for the most part. And so the only structure we found that works is one. And the master of this technique, by the way, is Apple. Right? Yeah, they have a great design capability and a great technology supply chain. I argue that Apple's their real innovation is organizational, because they will form a small team that's really disruptive. They will put that team at the edge of the organization. They will keep them totally secret and stealth, and they will say to them, go disrupt another industry. Right? That's what they do. Nobody else does this. Nobody else, what blows my mind is nobody's noticed that this is what they do. Right? All the analysts looking at it, et cetera, et cetera. So they have a portfolio of teams looking at different industries. When they think watches or retail or payments or cars is ready for disruption, they go into it and they fold it back into the iTunes platform. For God's sakes, if they would now only update iTunes, everybody would be much happier, but you know, they'll get there.
Last couple of comments on AI. Do you think we'll survive AI, or are you a pessimist, or?
So it's a very provocative thing to say, but I deeply disagree with these comments. I don't think AI takes over the world. And there's a couple of framings that I have for that. The first is, we don't know what intelligence is. We really don't have a definition for it. We don't even have a test for intelligence. So how do you say AI takes over the intelligence when we don't know what it is? So just for example, there's about a dozen facets of intelligence. There's and something like an IQ test is testing two of them: logical thought processing, the speed of that, and the ability to match concepts across frameworks. But we have spatial intelligence, we have emotional intelligence, we have the Eastern concept of presence or awareness. We don't measure any of those. And so when we say something is intelligent, we're stuck in a definition problem, right? And the second is, what would constitute overtaking? The minute I can prescriptively describe a task, an AI or robot is going to do a much better job of it than I am anyway. So the whole discussion becomes irrelevant. The best way I found of framing this, we worry about AIs taking over the world, and you always see it in a dystopian light. You always see that you end up with the Matrix or Skynet, and the robot overlords take over the world. If humanity is lucky, we're treated like pets, and if we're unlucky, we're food. You know, that's kind of basically the way it goes. But when you actually see how we're using AI or technology, we don't use it, it doesn't become replacements for humanity, it augments our capability.
Yeah.
Right?
But what about data bias and
Wait, let me finish that earlier point though. So I've got a particular bias there. The bigger point is, if something actually became self-conscious or something, we wouldn't even know. Right. So as I talked to one of our faculty who's been building robots for the last 20 years, and I said, is there a structure, construct in the world that has the inputs, outputs, processing, and feedback loops where it suddenly might become self-aware? And he said, let me think about that for a while. He came back 2 days later and he said, yeah, I've thought about something. Traffic systems. It turns out traffic systems have the processing inputs and outputs and feedback loops that one day a traffic system might suddenly go, oh, I'm a traffic system. And the two problems that come up: A, we wouldn't know, and B, what would it do? We have no idea. Right? And so this is the enormous challenge around how to think about this. And the last framing I'll put is, we're worried about AI becoming conscious, gaining more power, having access to the world's information, and then acting with impunity and ignoring our thing. We have a precedent for that. We call them children. And we raise kids, they have access to the world, they become more powerful, and then they ignore their parents. Right? And so we have quite a lot of ways of dealing with that. It's just we'll find ways of adapting, I think.
And I think one of the things is
That's
about
my little rant on AI.
about reliance on the private sector. I mean, can we trust the private sector sufficiently? They'll manage all our data, they'll have all our information, they're driven by profit and shareholder price and shareholder value and so on. So if they are the custodians of our future and our data, using AI as a powerful tool, is that an area for vigilance?
It is, but it's kind of too late, right? I mean, you look at Facebook, Google, Amazon, and the amount of data they have on you. I've been talking to some political technology consulting firms. 7 clicks in Facebook is all it needs for them to nail you completely and understand you inside out. 7 clicks. Liking something, sharing something, that's all it takes, and they know who you are instantly. Then you're basically a target to feed misinformation or whatever to, and somebody else can buy that data and then say, okay, we're going to feed these stories. So this is done. The battle's been lost already. The question is, can we recapture that? And you would argue probably not. There's a whole movement of saying I should own my own data. If I have a purchase history on Amazon, okay, they have a copy of it, but at least I should have a copy of it and be able to do what I want to do with it. There is no easy answer to that, because when you have global companies like Google or Facebook, the governance has to be global. The governance can't be Europe saying, and I'll give you a small example of this. I was talking to the top 100 media CEOs in Germany, and for historical reasons, it is illegal in the constitution of Germany. It is illegal to have a national media company, because of the Hitler in the 100 years ago. And so essentially they are forced by the Constitution to have local markets for media, and then Google comes along and they're literally not able to compete even if they want to, right? And this is the kind of the dichotomy that we get stuck with.
Let's open for a couple of questions. We're waiting for one of our guests, panelists. When he arrives, give me a signal, and then we'll start our panel.
Sure.
Guy.
Salim, I've got a first question relates to the 3 categories that Tarek put up on the slide about sort of businesses that have already been disrupted and those in the future that will. But just looking at transportation, do you think aviation and shipping as well as trucking, will be significantly disrupted because they seem to depend on the infrastructure of ports and airports and all that sort of thing?
Aviation is a tough one just because of the sheer scale of it, right? The best idea we've seen in long distance travel is shooting up a rocket and then bringing people back down somewhere else, which seems to be faster than anything else. We've tried the hypersonic flight paths, etc. I think what happens is before you can make radical improvements in that, virtual reality and virtual avatars become so real life that it becomes irrelevant, right? So already we use Zoom for 80% of our meetings now. Our ecosystem is actually global. Our core senior management team has never met in person. Our CFOs in one part of the world, our COOs in another part of the world, etc. And so we, at any point out of the 5 or 6 of us, 3 or 4 of us meet, but we've never had all of us 6 meet at the same time. And you can actually, I don't know if it'll decline, but it'll become a very different nature of travel. Because the cost is dropping, it's easier to get around via travel, so you'll see much more leisure travel, much more enjoyment, people going places for experiences, which we want to crave. I live for the day that an avatar can give this presentation. I don't have to be here in the flesh. And Jerry, I'm sure you're the same for many of us that travel a lot. This is an avatar. That's a whole lot. That requires a lot of alcohol. So let's not get into the part there. But what will happen is because virtual reality is doubling so quickly, we're almost at the point where VR will exceed the resolution of the human eye, right? And the minute you do that, you have total virtual reality in lots of different ways. So there's an Avatar X Prize right now for having a presence that you can't tell is real or not. Right?
We have a question here.
So
please.
shipping. I think shipping gets massively disrupted by 2 or 3 things. I think one is that you have about more than 90% of shipped goods are less than a cubic foot in size. So 3D printing starts to really hit that. The second is something like 40% of global shipping is oil. And so the minute that you have a drop in oil prices, et cetera, that becomes a huge issue. The last oil price crash was created by a 2% oversupply in the market. It's a very tightly wound market. So the minute you have the next big major step in solar or storage or something, I think oil prices, I predict oil prices will have another crash in oil prices this year or in 2020. And it'll drop back down to $15, $20 a barrel and will never come back. That's my prediction on it.
Okay, good question. Sir.
My question is about also disruption, the slide. I couldn't see the education. I have 2 kids. Every day they are complaining that they don't want to go to school because they are using technology very well, but they are still going to the same style that I have been when I was a child. So what shall we see? I mean, I hear lots of ed tech, but is it going so slow?
Education.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time do we have on this one. We get asked that a lot because of the concept of Singularity University. So let me give you 3 or 4 data points around that. One is, if you're doing a master's degree in any of these technologies, advanced robotics, neuroscience, biotech, etc., today, by the time you finish your master's degree, you're out of date, which is totally surreal, right? And so the concept of a degree becomes less relevant. Second data point, it's one of the structures we introduced at Singularity University. When you're trying to teach these new technologies, we have to update our curriculum in real time. So when there's a new breakthrough in deep learning, the faculty gets together and immediately talks about what are the implications, how would that affect autonomous cars or 3D printing or neuroscience or biotech, and it gets integrated into the curriculum in real time. The curriculum is changing about 20% a quarter. Okay? And this causes an interesting problem. It turns out even though the best leaders, thought leaders, scientists, researchers in the world are coming to teach at Singularity University, it's impossible to become kind of an authorized, state-sanctioned educational institution, because to be legalized, you have to fix your curriculum and not change it. Kind of a problem, right? And I'll give you the last data point, which is we are routing around old structure in lots of old ways. So in the past, when you had to decide which restaurant should you go to, you'd read the restaurant critic, see what restaurant they'd recommend and decide. Now you go to Yelp or anything similar, read 20 reviews, and you know everything that's happening at that restaurant, right? And so we've routed around that structure. In education, what's happening is there's a platform called GitHub, okay, which is relevant as an EXO, by the way. So this is a platform for software developers to collaborate that got created. It's an exponential organization. On GitHub, I can rate you as a software developer, and you can rate my code. They've created a peer-to-peer gamifications of rating each other. It's been so successful that if you're a software developer in Silicon Valley today, your salary has zero bearing on what degree you got, what university you went to, what your grades were. It's 100% what is your GitHub rating. A pure peer-to-peer meritocracy replaces the old structure. Just like your Uber driver rating dictates whether you get, which rides you get, etc. So we're replacing old top-down regulatory structures with this bottom-up convergent, transparent meritocracy. So the value of a computer science degree is now zero. And by the way, GitHub, which is this platform, was the highest rated exponential organization we ever saw. It uses all of the characteristics in the model. It's 10 years old. It has no workforce, no intellectual property, no assets. Okay? And Microsoft just bought this company for $7.5 billion. Okay? I'm just going to repeat that. No assets, no workforce, no intellectual property, $7.5 billion. If you're not building one of those, what the hell are you doing? Right? That's how dramatic it gets. And in fact, Francisco made a really phenomenal framing of this. He said, in the future, we won't be building startups, you'll be building exponential organizations. Because you can't compete with that model over time.
Final question, and then we'll get the panel.
Yeah. So as we talk about a future that is based on trust, ethics, values, empathy, of moving more towards abundance, which is removing fear from scarcity, all of that requires a kind of a common language in culture between people to be able to get them to consider the commons problem, essentially. So what can we, or I guess either what trends or what can be done to help accelerate that common identity, because once that happens, you get automatic trust, and you kind of build that global culture. So,
what can we do to accelerate global culture? Unfortunately, the best answer I have right now is Game of Thrones, which you get these media phenomena, and this is why I think media is so important, because the one framing that we have found that actually shapes and changes your worldview is the power of narrative. Right? And we have a lot of old narrative, religious narratives, et cetera, Now we have kind of story type narratives. The US is based on the hero's journey, et cetera. Now we need new narratives for what this future looks like. And we need to figure out what those narratives look like. We don't have a clear answer for that. It's been true in the past that narrative is very, very localized because of the historical geography. So you take some concept like Christianity and you localize it to Indonesia. I remember trekking around in Indonesia and coming across a tribe of Christian cannibals. Literally, because the missionaries started coming, they ate the first few, and then they listened to a couple, they got converted to Christianity, but they refused to get rid of the cannibalism, so they've morphed the thing, and now you have Christian cannibals there, right? And so very bizarre packaging and adaptation of old structures into new. We need to find totally new models and metaphors for this. Global media is the only one that we have. It's just not a great answer. So we need to figure that out. We need to figure out a way of, and unfortunately the one that we have, science fiction, has been one dominant way of creating a global view, but people watch less and less of it now and read less and less science fiction, which is unfortunate.
Salim, thank you very much indeed. Big hand for Salim for...
Thank you.